Welcome back to another lesson for first semester of New Testament Greek. This is lesson 3. And as we begin this lesson, I'd like to ask you a question as a Greek student at this point. Halenas ti gnoskes? That's from Acts 21, verse 37, where the Apostle Paul is in Jerusalem about to be overtaken by a mob, and he's rescued by Roman soldiers, and he's brought before the commander, and the commander asks him that very question. And you should be able to interpret that question at this point. It's a question, first of all, as you can see from the punctuation mark at the end with the semicolon, which in Greek means a question mark. And then you learned a verb in your last lesson as part of your vocabulary words. It's the verb gnosko. And as it occurs here in Acts 21, verse 37, it's the second person singular form, present active indicative of gnosko, as Paul individually is being asked a question by the Roman commander. And so you should be able to answer this question with an affirmative, yes, I do know Greek. Sometimes that phrase is translated in English translations as, can you speak Greek? But really that's not the verb speak, laleo, or other words for speaking, but it's the word know, and you already know this term. So I just wanted to encourage you with a little bit of biblical information there that you can read that part of the Greek New Testament and understand it. Now in this lesson, we're going to introduce nouns and articles and how to decline them. And in order to do that, you're going to have to learn something called the case system. And the case system can seem pretty overwhelming to a new student, especially one who's only familiar with the English language, as Greek is quite different from English with its case system, as I'll explain. I also want to just encourage you at the outset of this lesson to take some time to learn this lesson well. Be patient with this lesson, review it as many times as you need to until you feel comfortable with its contents, with how nouns and articles function and the case system and how to decline those articles and nouns. Initially, the case system can seem quite strange and unfamiliar, especially to English-speaking students, because we don't have a case system in English that works like the Greek system does. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'll explain this all later in this lesson, but for now, just think of the English article for the definite article, the, T-H-E. It's spelled the same way, whether it is modifying a noun that's the subject of a sentence, whether it's modifying a noun that is the object in a sentence, or whether it's modifying a noun that is the object of a preposition in a prepositional phrase. But in Greek, that changes. The article changes its spelling, its ending, as well as the noun, depending on its use or function within a sentence. And so that creates a great variety of different spellings for one definite article and one noun. Now in English, let's take a simple sentence like, the boy hit the ball. The boy is the subject of the sentence, and the ball is the object. The boy hit the ball. But that can be reversed, and the spelling is the same. The ball hit the boy. The definite article remains the same, T-H-E, whether it's the subject or the object. And if you had a prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence, that would stay the same as well. But in Greek, the function of a noun within a sentence requires a different ending or spelling. And the same with the article. So you're going to have this great variety of different spellings compared to English. And this is where it gets quite complex for a beginning English student, and where I've seen Greek students in the past become overwhelmed, and they almost feel like by lesson 3 in this course, their head's going to explode. And so I hope that you're just patient and you recognize this is a different language that other people through history have learned very well, and other Greek students have, and you'll get through it too. Just be aware that you may need to put a little more work into this lesson, as it's going to be one of the more difficult ones for first year Greek. At least it will seem difficult initially, but as the course goes on and you learn more parts of speech that are built on the case system. I think by the time you look in the rearview mirror behind you in retrospect, this will seem fairly elementary. But initially it's going to be a challenge, to be a steeper learning curve. And I also just want to help you to understand that Greek has essentially 5 cases to it for, let's say, a noun or an article functioning in a sentence. And again, we'll explain what those cases are and what a case means. But when you multiply that by a factor of 2, not only for a singular noun, but also when it's put in its plural form, now you're up to 10 potential different spellings. And then nouns in Greek can be masculine, feminine, or neuter, so 3 different genders. So now you're up, multiply the 10 by a factor of 3, and potentially you could have up to 30 different spellings for a simple noun or article in Greek that you don't have in English, where it's really simple in English, just spell T-H-E every time, or a noun is spelled the same every time. And so you can see why this can seem initially quite overwhelming to a new student, but I just want you to take heart in this little tidbit as well, that other languages use the case system, like Czech. They have 7 different cases, or I believe it's Finnish that has 15 different cases, or Hungarian has 18 different cases, and Greek only has essentially 5. Some say 8. You'll learn about the 5 versus the 8 in this lesson. So let me just encourage you with that. Be patient, be prayerful, be dependent on the Lord as you go through this lesson, and the Lord will give you the sufficiency for learning this so that you can fulfill your objective of rightly dividing the word of truth and being a diligent workman. Let's begin with our vocabulary list from chapter 4 of our Ray Summers textbook. We're going to go over chapters 4 and 5 for our vocabulary list here for this lesson number 3 in our lesson. But before we go down this list and pronounce all these words, let me just make a couple comments about the importance of proper pronunciation. If you're able to accurately pronounce these words and you memorize them with that accurate pronunciation, that's going to help you with remembering how to accurately spell these words. And when you can accurately spell these words based on an accurate pronunciation, that will then help you as well to distinguish between similar sounding words that are actually separate words. So there is value in being able to accurately pronounce these words right from the beginning. I do want to mention too, as you look down the list of these vocabulary words, you'll see that some of them end with Omicron sigma, and then some of them end with Omicron nu. The ones that end with Omicron sigma indicate for you that these are masculine forms of the word, and even that they're in the nominative case. The words that end in Omicron nu, those are in the neuter gender, and they're also in the nominative case. In fact, the nominative case form of a noun is what will be its dictionary or lexical case form. It's very important that you remember that. So let's start at the top with our first word, and that is anthropos. And at the end, separated from anthropos, you'll see the letter Omicron with the rough breathing sound over it, so it would be ha, anthropos. The ha is the article that goes with this noun, and that tells you that this is also masculine in gender. Nouns in Greek have either masculine, neuter, or feminine genders. Now this is grammatical gender. It is not technically gender for real life in terms of what this noun is. And I'll just state, anthropos does not necessarily mean that it's talking about men versus women. You might think that because it's masculine in its spelling or form and it has the masculine article. But anthropos is a general term for all of humanity. Now there is a separate Greek word that is used for males in particular in distinction to females, and that would be the word aner, a male or a married man, a husband. But in this case, anthropos is generic. It's where we get the term anthropology from, the study of mankind. So think of it that way. The next word down the list is apostolos. And again, that's masculine because of the article ha. And so you should always memorize the article that goes with the noun, because that will help you remember again the gender of that noun. So apostolos means apostle. Artos, or ha artos, is bread or the bread. This is the term that is used in John chapter 6, where Jesus Christ is spoken of as the bread of life, a very common term in the New Testament. Then the next word you have after that is doron, ta doron, which means it's a neuter word. This is the word for gift. In fact, this is the word that is used in Ephesians 2:8. For by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. That's the word doron in that verse. Next is the word thanatos, or ha thanatos, and this is the word for death. After that is the word for temple, hieron, ta hieron, it's neuter. And then after that is the word kai, which is a conjunction, could be translated and, even, or also. And as I mentioned in the previous lesson, the word kai constitutes 6% of all occurrences of words in the New Testament. So you should have already down at least 6% of every Greek word in your understanding. After that is the word kurios, or ha kurios, it's masculine. This is the term for Lord, very common throughout the New Testament. Most of the time when you see a description of Jesus Christ as the Lord Jesus Christ, this will be the Greek word for Lord. Continuing with our chapter 4 vocabulary, at the top we have lithos, ha lithos, which is the word for stone. After that is nomos, ha nomos, the word for law, and this is very common, especially throughout Paul's writings as he contrasts law and grace. In fact, sometimes you may have heard the expression that those who don't believe that they're under the dispensation of law or have to follow the Old Testament law, we are sometimes slapped with or accused of the label of being antinomian. And the word nomian comes from nomos, meaning law, and anti, meaning against law. And so this is the word that underlies that claim or that label, antinomian. After that is the word for house, which is oikos, ha oikos, it's masculine. And then the word for crowd is aklos, or ha aklos. This is a term very common throughout the Gospels, as you see that the multitudes or the crowds, could be translated either way, followed the Lord Jesus wherever he went. Next is the word for son, huios, is how you pronounce it, ha huios. And this is the term that is used for Jesus Christ being the Son of God or Son of Man. And also there's a similar term you'll learn later, huiothesios, or huiothesia is the term for a son, one who's received an adult sonship status. And it's based on this root word for son as well. And that's something that the Galatians chapter 4 speaks of, when every believer is called an adopted son with adult sonship, advanced standing privileges in terms of our position in Christ. So very important word, this word huios. Okay, let's move on to our vocabulary list for chapter 5 from our Ray Summers textbook. And as you look at this list, initially you'll see some major distinctions. For example, the article that goes with each of these nouns, in this case, is feminine. The eta, with the rough breathing, he, indicates that these will be feminine, in contrast to what we saw in the previous chapter or list, where the article was either omicron with the rough breathing, ha, or ta, for the neuter or masculine or neuter forms of nouns. So you can tell, and you should always memorize again, the article that goes with these nouns, because it will tell you what gender they are. And then at the end of each of these nouns for chapter 5, you see that they end with either eta at the top, such as agape, or the word below it, aletheia, they end in alpha. The alpha or eta endings are again another clue that these are going to be probably feminine, but you need to know the article, which will be the key to tell you what the gender is. And also the distinction that we see here with chapter 5 and these nouns ending in either eta or alpha is another clue that these are part of what's called the first declension set of nouns. What we saw in the last chapter, or chapter 4, our vocabulary list there, which those verbs or the nouns ended in omicron or omicron sigma, the os sound, or they ended in on, the omicron nu ending, again either masculine or neuter. That told us that those are part of what's called the second declension set of nouns. So let's start at the top for chapter 5 with our first declension noun list, starting with the very first word, and it is a word that you're probably already familiar with, agape. This is one of several different words for love in the New Testament, and this speaks again of this highest form of Christian love. It's similar to the verb that occurs in John 3:16, agapao, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. This is simply now just the noun form of that verb. Next on the list is aletheia. He aletheia. This is the word for truth. Below that is hamartia. He hamartia, which is the word for sin. And then below that is basileia, which is the word for kingdom. And below that is glossa, which is the word for tongue or language, such as you see in Acts chapter 2 or in 1 Corinthians chapters 12 through 14, speaks of the spiritual gifts, and it uses the word there as well in the plural for tongues, glossolalia. And then also below that is the word for scripture or writing, and that is graphe. Below that is didache, which is the word for teaching or doctrine, could be translated. Now this is different from the action of teaching, which is didasko, a very similar word having the same stem, but in this case the noun didache refers to the substance of what is taught, not the act of teaching. Below that we see the word doxa, which is the word for glory. Again, another very common word throughout the New Testament. Continuing on with our vocabulary list for chapter 5, let's start at the top with he eirene. Eirene is the word for peace in Greek, but you may recognize that this sounds similar or looks somewhat similar to the name in English for a woman, that of Irene. That's where the name Irene comes from. It's just transliterated from the Greek. And then below that you have the word for church, ekklesia. Perhaps a better, more literal translation would just simply be an assembly or a called out assembly. Because sometimes we know that ekklesia in the New Testament, such as in the book of Acts, can refer to even a secular body that gathers, such as in Ephesus, Acts 19. Has a crowd that gathered there to persecute the Apostle Paul. And so definitely they were not part of the Church of Jesus Christ. They were a separate, secular, called out body. But the term itself refers to out, from the preposition ek, and then kaleo, meaning to call, and hence its etymological combined meaning would be a called out assembly. And below that is the word for commandment, he entele. Below that is the word for power or authority, exousia. And below that is the word for day, hemera. And now you notice that the gender switches because the article changes from eta to omicron. And so ha mathetes refers to a disciple. Below that is the word for a parable, ha parabole. And notice that though the ending is eta, the article is omicron. So initially, without the article, you might think that parabole, the word for a parable, is a feminine word in Greek, but it's actually not, it's masculine. And below that is the word for a prophet, prophetes, ha prophetes. And so that's it for our vocabulary list for this lesson. Before we go into nouns and explain the case system, it's very important that we just take a moment to review the different parts of speech, in English or in Greek for that matter. And at the top you'll see verbs. Verbs, of course, describe an action or state. They are put number 1 because they are the most important part of the sentence. And as we'll learn in Greek, a verb, well, we learned in the last lesson actually, that a verb all by itself has its subject built into it. And so a verb by itself can form an entire sentence in Greek. So it's clearly the number 1 place in terms of priority and importance. Secondly, after that is the noun. What does a noun do? Well, it identifies a person, place, object, or idea. After that is a pronoun that stands in the place of a noun. And no, a pronoun is not a noun that gets paid. After that, fourth is adjective, and this gives more information about a noun. And then we have adverbs, which give more information about an action or a state, like the verb. It further modifies or explains a verb. And then we have prepositions, which express relationship between 2 or more words. We'll have a separate lesson all on adjectives, all on adverbs and prepositions. And then conjunctions connect words or groups of words, and you've already learned at least one of these, such as kai. And then after that is the article. Now in Greek, there is no indefinite article, like we would write the letter A in English to signify the indefinite article. There is in Greek rather only a word by itself with no article, or with the definite article, the word the. And in this lesson, we're going to look at definite articles for each of the different cases. Ninth, we have participles. What is a participle? Well, it is a verbal noun, a word used as a verb or a noun. And typically, in English anyway, they have the ing ending, and that's how you should translate them. When you see a participle in Greek into English, you'll translate it with a word or a verb that has that ing ending. And then 10th, we see infinitives. These are a verbal part of speech. They're technically not a verb, just like participles aren't a verb. They're a verbal part of speech, a verbal noun for the participles. And here the infinitive is verbal, but it functions like a noun. And we would typically translate these with the word to and then something to follow, like to err is human, to forgive is divine. There you have 2 infinitives in that English sentence. Now, another thing that I should clarify here from this different parts of speech is that in Greek, each part of speech is going to have a different spelling depending on its case. I should backtrack even further. Nouns, pronouns, adjectives, prepositions, and participles all use the case system. And so in other words, a noun can occur in one of several different cases that we're going to learn about. And so that noun isn't spelled one way in Greek. The same noun with the same meaning can be spelled a variety of different ways depending on the case that it occurs or appears in. And that's going to be true not only of nouns, but also of pronouns and of adjectives and prepositions and participles. I would say roughly 60% of the Greek language uses the case system. And that just underscores how important this case system is for you to learn and learn well. In fact, it's initially very difficult to learn the case system, as you have a lot of memorizing to do with this lesson and then the next few lessons that use the case system as well. But after the first few lessons here that we learn this case system and you get it under your belt, so to speak, I think you'll see it's very logical and it makes good sense. And once you learn the endings, you're kind of over that cliff, that steep learning curve. You're at the top of that now, and it tends to plateau or level out and becomes repetitive and not so difficult. But initially, this case system is fairly daunting. And it's integral that you learn this because it's such a prominent part of this language, being used in about 60% of all the words you're going to face. In fact, I'll just say this, that if you don't grasp this case system, you're dead in the water as far as understanding Greek. It's that important and that foundational. So take your time with this lesson to learn it well. No matter how long it takes you, it may be frustrating, but I think if you just dedicate yourself to memorizing the different case forms, you will grasp it and you will be able to proceed ahead. As we already saw from our vocabulary list, all nouns in Greek have a gender assigned to them, and their gender will be signified by the article that precedes the noun or goes with it, and that's why it's integral that you memorize the article as well as the noun for your memorization work. In Greek, nouns have a gender, and they require a specific article that matches it in gender. In English, we don't have that. We just use the word the in a generic sense without respect to the gender of the noun that the article is going with. And here's some examples I put for you here. Ha basileus, which is the word for the king. And below that, you will see he basileia. Notice the different genders. The kingdom in Greek is feminine, whereas the king is masculine. Now, why that exists, we don't know. How that evolved so that the king obviously sounds masculine. You know, he's not a female. The king is usually male in distinction to the queen. But why did then the kingdom become feminine in distinction or part of the realm of the king? You would think that the king being masculine and his kingdom then would be masculine as well. But actually in Greek, it's a separate gender. And the same is true when it comes to sin. The word below that, he hamartia, literally the sin it would be translated, is feminine. Now you might say, boo, boo, this sounds, very misogynist, against women. Why did sin become feminine in Greek? Well, hold on a minute. Ha hamartolos, the sinner, is actually masculine in Greek. So again, it just goes to show you that there's sometimes no rhyme or reason for why different languages came up with masculine or feminine genders, and these are grammatical genders. There's nothing inherently feminine, for example, about kingdom, or inherently feminine about sin, because men and women are sinners. So why this is, why these ended up with the genders they have, we don't know. It ultimately doesn't matter. Just know that there are grammatical genders for each of these nouns that you're going to learn for Greek. Before we look at Greek nouns and articles, let me just use an example from Spanish that I think most of us can understand and relate to that will clarify Greek nouns and articles and gender. Here we have in Spanish the word the angel, masculine singular. The angel, in Spanish it would be el ángel, or angel, however that's pronounced in Spanish. But then below that you can see the plural form, los angeles, or probably slaughtering how this is pronounced in Spanish. But you get the idea. There's an entire city by that name here in the United States, in Southern California. And the name of that city is simply the masculine plural form of the angels, it would be translated. And hence they have a baseball team stationed right there, situated in Los Angeles, called the Angels, as well as the LA Dodgers. But that's another story. Now below that is a different article for, this time, a feminine city, Las Vegas, which literally means the meadows in Spanish. and this is the plural form of a meadow, and it's feminine. But my point is to show you that the article before the noun changes. And the same situation is going to ensue with Greek. There's a certain gender and number that must match between the article and the noun. That's also true in Greek. And here's another common example from another language that we all know in terms of this word, the word for Auto, which is car in German. Das Auto would be the car, and German has three articles, masculine, feminine, and neuter forms, der, die, das. And in German, just like with Spanish, the the gender and the number, whether singular or plural, of the noun must match with the article that precedes it. Now in German, they use the case system. They have 4 cases, and Greek has at least 5, some say 8, as we'll see. But the case and the gender and the number must all match between the article and the noun. In order to understand the case system, let me just introduce here 4 key words: nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. And what these are different cases in which the same word, literally word, as you see here highlighted in yellow, or the word if you add the article before it, what each of these indicate for us are 4 different cases depending on how the same word is used. And I've put it in 4 different sentences here to illustrate this for you in English. So the first sentence is, the word came to the students with great power. And in this case, the same expression, word, is being, or the word, is in the nominative case in terms of its function within the sentence, because the word in this first instance is being used as the noun, or the subject. It is a noun, but it's functioning as a subject here. Now, going down to the second sentence, the student spoke the word with great power. Here you have the exact same word, same spelling in this instance in English, but here it's used in the accusative case and with the function of being the object of the verb. And that's what the accusative case does in Greek. It is the object case form or function within the sentence, whereas nominative is going to be your subject form or spelling. Going down to the third line, it says the student spoke powerfully with the word. And here, with the word, that expression indicates that this is dative case form. And then lastly, the sentence at the bottom says the power of the word. That would indicate that it's a genitive use there in that sentence. So just to show you that the same expression, the word, depending on how it is used and functioning within a sentence, in English, it's always going to be spelled the same way, whether it's one of these 4 functions. But in other languages, if it has one of these 4 functions, like in German or Greek, it's going to have a separate spelling dependent on that function, or that indicates its function, and that is the case system. And here again is an example of German, going back to our word for car in German, Auto, and what you'll see are 3 different symbols for 3 different German car manufacturers, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, and Bavarian Motor Works, or BMWs. But you also see on the far left the 4 different cases, or case categories, as I've described them already. But to the right of that, you see the singular and the plural uses of the article to go with auto. Now notice sometimes, for example, on the far right column, autos is the full spelling, whereas the shorter form without the S on the end, auto, is used for the singular. But you'll notice as you look at the German articles that precede auto or autos, that there are here 6 different ways to say the car or the cars. Das Auto for the nominative and accusative, or di autos for the nominative and accusative. They have the same spelling, but then you come down to the dative and it's dem auto, or den autos, or des autos for the genitive, or der autos. And so just to show you that the same word for car can be spelled different ways, and it requires a different definite article spelling depending on its use or function within the sentence, depending on the case in which it occurs. Okay, so having seen how the case system is used in other languages like German, let's switch now back to Greek and look at one word, the word for law, one of our vocabulary words in this lesson. Here you can see 8 different cases in which this word law is used. And you can see, depending on the case itself, the spelling will change for the form of that word, namas, from its lexical form, that nominative case form. It'll change to namu, or namo, or naman, or nama, if it's vocative, and then you'll see whether it's singular or plural, it'll change as well. And you see that the article preceding the noun changes as well. So depending on the spelling, that will tell you what the case is in which this noun is being used. And so I also want to explain that though you see 8 different cases used here, most Greek scholars believe there's 5 actual cases in Greek, and that is because there's really only 5 forms that are distinguishable, because the genitive ablative shares the same form, as well as the dative, locative, and instrumental, they share the same form. So 8 condenses really down to 5. So if you were to use a modern Greek grammar, almost all of them will tell you there's a 5-case system in Greek. But one of the reasons why I like having this older system that says in the Ray Summers textbook that there are 8 cases is because even if you have a 5-case system that you're learning from let's say a newer Greek grammar book, you would still have to think through the distinctions between genitive and ablative, or between the dative, locative, and instrumental. And by the way, if you were to use the modern 5-case system, they would not say that there is an ablative case. They would simply say nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and vocative. So in other words, they would combine the ablative under the genitive. They would combine locative and instrumental under dative. So that's how they would distinguish 5 versus the 8 cases. But one of the reasons, again, going back to the Ray Summers textbook in this older system, I think there's value in you having to learn 8 cases and then condense it in your mind to, there's really only 5 forms. But the value is that you will be able to think through the different uses of the ablative in distinction to the genitive, or the locative and instrumental in distinction to the dative. And as you go through this list of words that occurs here, you can see that for each case, you will use a different translation. Of course, ha namas just means the law, or hoi namoi means the laws, plural. But that is going to be your nominative case form. And the nominative, again, is, think of it this way, the noun that gets nominated to be the subject of the sentence. It is basically your subject form of the noun. The noun functioning as a subject is the nominative case. Below that is genitive, and the genitive is simply the noun that is translated of, with the preposition of. Instead of the law, it's of the law, or of the laws, plural, in the case of ton namon. And below that is ablative, and you'll always want to use the word from for an ablative case when you translate. It's just instead of the law, it's from the law. So for instance, if you were to read a Greek sentence and you saw tu namu, you would have to know in your mind, I can either translate that of the law or from the law. both are legitimate. It could be either genitive or ablative. It's sort of an interpretative judgment call at that point. And the same is true if you were to see the form below that on the dative line, to namo. If you were to see that expression, the law, you know that you would translate that to or for the law. That would be the pure dative sense. Or the other spelling that is identical to it right below it, it could be also translated in or on the law. Or in the instrumental sense, it could be translated with or by the law. So if you see this one construction, to namo, just know in your mind and be able to think through. It's either to or for, that would be dative, in or on, that would be locative, or with or by, that would be instrumental. And then the accusative case form of law would be tan naman. And that is again going to be your object form, the object of the subject and the verb followed by the object. That's almost always going to be the dative case form. Vocative form is the form of address, where you are speaking to the law, let's say, almost calling to it, personifying it, like, hey law, come to me, or hey law, listen up. And so that's the vocative form. Vocative form is not used very often in the Greek New Testament. So those are your 8 cases that you should be able to think through and note the separate spellings for each one of them. For most of them, the 5 different spellings for the 8-case system. For this course, you are required to have the William Mounce summary charts, and this is just a photo extract of one portion of that summary chart, a very small portion, dealing with the articles. And you can ignore the column on your far right that says relative pronoun. That's something that you're going to learn in a future lesson. For this lesson, you will have to memorize what is on the left under definite article. You will have to memorize the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms for all the cases, whether singular or plural. And I just want to underscore how important this is. If you memorize these articles and you know them backwards and forwards, up and down, so that you fall asleep at night and you see them on the back of your eyelids, that's how well you need to know these, because they're going to go with other parts of speech, as you'll see, and they are really the key that will tell you whether a noun is singular or plural, whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. It'll tell you, but just by looking at the article, what case that noun is and what this article goes with in terms of another noun in the sentence. So you must master these, memorize them, write them out repeatedly until you have them down. And it'll make your workbook assignments much easier going forward if you memorize these. Know these forms just like you know your personal cell phone number. They're that important. Here's another portion from the William Mounce summary chart, and this is the section dealing with the forms for first and second declension nouns. And you'll see listed here 6 columns. You should memorize these. 4 of these are for first declension nouns, and 2 of these are for second declension nouns. But again, master these spellings, these endings, and you'll see a pattern after a while that there's a lot of overlap and similarity with some of these. So it's not like you're learning, for example, 8 times 6, 48 different forms. There's often some repetition among these forms and some rhyme and reason. And you'll see the similarities as you just work on memorizing these endings. So that's something you'll be required to do for this lesson. And I know it's, again, a steep learning curve with all this memorization. But when we get to pronouns and adjectives, etc., those other parts of speech, you're going to see that this case system is all the same for the other parts of speech. So this is initially a steeper climb in terms of the memorization workload that will get easier with the successive lessons in this course. On this slide, you'll see the same exact words, but put in two different orders. And as a result, in English, they have two different meanings, depending on the position, for instance, of the word God in the sentence. At the top, God loved the world. In that sentence, God is functioning as the subject who's doing the action of loving. So the word loved is, of course, your action or your verb. And then the world is the object receiving the love of God. In the bottom, when the object and the subject are reversed, it has an entirely different meaning. The world loved God, very different, as you'll see. And so in English, even though all these words are spelled exactly the same in both sentences, they have a different meaning depending on where they're at in the sentence. This is not the case in Greek. In Greek, you can have the subject at the end of the sentence. You can have the object at the very beginning of the sentence. Word order in Greek doesn't mean much. In fact, that is where you'll see the value of the case system. If you have a word like theos for God in this instance in Greek, and you know it's preceded by the article, and the article tells you that it's masculine nominative singular, you could have ha theos at the end of the sentence and still know that it is functioning as the subject of the sentence because of its case form spelling. That's the value of the case form system. And that's why Greek is a little frustrating at first, initially, for students to learn, but just think of it as similar to how Yoda talked in the movie Star Wars, if you ever saw that movie, where he would say something like, not as critical word order in Greek as English it is. Now you can still decipher the meaning of that sentence, but all the words are out of order, but you can still make heads and tails out of that. And Greek is, again, very clear based on the spellings or case forms of words in the sentence. So having given you a broad overview of the case system, let's go back to each of these cases one by one, and I'll explain a little more about each case. In the very first instance, we have the nominative case. Here again is ha namas, singular, the law, or hoi namoi for plural, the laws. And this particular word, again, is a second declension noun form. And with this spelling of namas or namoi, and especially with that article in front of it, in each case, singular or plural, you'll be able to tell that this is functioning as the word namas or namoi is functioning as the subject in the sentence. That's its function. Now, in some sentences, you're going to have linking verbs or being verbs, such as the word are in this case in English, or a in Greek. And what that means is you're going to have a nominative case form of a spelling of a word on both sides of that linking or being verb. Here, for instance, you have the word for Christ, Christos, preceded by the article ha. And with the ending of Christos and the article, you know that that is in the nominative case form, just like ha namas for the law. And combined here with the second person personal pronoun su for you, is how it would be translated in English, you know that this is also in the nominative case form. And so you basically have here two nominative case form words functioning on both sides of this sentence. But here in this instance, ha Christos would be the predicate nominative technically. And here's another example of a sentence, Galatians 1:1, where you have two words that are both in the nominative case form, both masculine, both singular, and both nominative. And in this case, Paulos apostolos would be translated Paul, an apostle. And in this case, you don't have two subjects per se, but what you do have in the case of apostolos is a further explanation or qualification of Paul as the subject. It's telling you something further about Paul with this added nominative case form. And so that's why there's a comma even put between Paul and apostle. This is what's technically called a nominative of apposition. So the word apostolos stands in apposition to the word Paul or Paulos. Moving on from the nominative case now to the genitive case, we see again that ha namas in the nominative case form is translated with a different spelling, or it actually occurs in a different spelling in Greek, tu namu, and thus we would translate it differently in English as of the law, or whatever the noun is, you would just simply add of if you were translating this. And the genitive case is what's called the case of description. We see an example of this in 2 Thessalonians 3:5, where it says, "Now may the Lord direct your hearts into the love of God." And the particular spelling for theos there is the genitive case form spelling. So instead of theos with the omicron sigma ending, that would be the lexical case form. In this instance, it's theou. And that omicron upsilon diphthong shows you that this is genitive case of God. The third case form here would be ablative, moving on from genitive. Again, ablative has the same spelling or case form of a word, if you will, but it functions differently in this sense that you wouldn't translate it of the law, but in this case from. So whenever you see ablative, again, you'll have to determine in the sentence which makes better sense when you're translating. Is it genitive, meaning of something, or is it ablative, meaning from? And ablative carries more of the idea of separation. We see that here with Galatians 1, verse 8, where it says, "But even if we, or an angel from heaven." Now, in this instance, there's actually a preposition that means from or out of, namely ek or ex, as it's used here. But the word for heaven, uranos, is actually here now in the ablative case form, or it's the same form or spelling as the genitive, but clearly it doesn't mean of an angel of heaven. It means from heaven. In other words, if someone came from heaven as an angel and preached another gospel to you, don't believe it, is Paul's point. So even though here in verse 8 there's a separate preposition for from, ek, and by the way, we'll learn that later in another lesson, the idea of from can still be seen even if the preposition were not found in the sentence, just simply based on the fact that the word for heaven occurs in the ablative case form. And now we come to the dative case form, the fourth form down, to namo, or in the plural, tois namois. And whenever you see this particular form with this article, with the tau and then the omega iota subscript and the omega iota subscript ending for the noun, then you'll have to ask yourself, is it a pure dative, which would be translated either to the law or for the law, or in the plural, to the laws or for the laws? You'll always have to ask yourself those questions as you're reading the Greek sentence and translating in your mind. But the dative is the case of personal interest or direction. We see that in Romans 6, verse 2, where it says, "How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it?" And sin is one of your Greek vocabulary words for this lesson, hamartia. And here you can see that it's in the dative case form, te hamartia. And so it would be translated to sin. Now, sometimes for sin doesn't make sense, and that's why you would reduce it to simply to sin. And so you'll have to either ask yourself, if it's a dative case in spelling, should I translate this to sin or for sin? And you'll have to just ask which makes better sense in the sentence. And sometimes it's a difficult judgment call. But for instance, would this make sense? How shall we who died for sin live any longer in it? No, we didn't die for sin. Christ died for sin. But how shall we who died to sin, to our sin nature, live any longer in it? That makes much better sense. So you would translate it with the word to instead of for. And after the dative case comes the locative case. Again, the same spelling as the dative, to namo or tois namois, but in this case, or this instance, you would translate it in or on instead of to or for. And the locative case is the case of location or position. For instance, in John 19, verse 2, it says, "And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head." On his head speaks of location. Literally, the highlighted yellow portion, autou te kephale, means the head of him. And the word before it, epetheken, has the idea of upon. So upon the head of him, or we would just simply translate it in English, on his head. But here again, you can see the idea of position or location. Even though it has the same spelling for the dative case form of the head, in this instance, it would clearly be locative. We wouldn't say, for instance, in the dative sense, "And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it to the head of him," or for the head of him, but rather on the head of him or on his head. Seems to make the best sense. And so even though the spellings are the same for the article and the noun for kephale, the dative case form in this instance, we would still view it as locative because it makes better sense in the context. The sixth case form is the instrumental case, and again it is spelled exactly the same way as the locative case or dative case spellings or forms. But if a word such as to namo were found in a sentence, depending on the context and the reading of that sentence, sometimes it would make better sense to view it as instrumental. And if that's the case, rather than locative or dative, then you would translate it with the words with or by the law. And the instrumental case is the case of means. In other words, something being an instrument and or means. Now here we have what's called a third declension noun. That's a category of noun for grace right here, karati, that you're going to learn later in a future lesson. But for now, just understand even third declension nouns function exactly the same as first and second declension nouns. But here we have the use of the word for grace. And so, for by grace you have been saved, Ephesians 2:8. And clearly here, the highlighted yellow portions, te karati, are clearly instrumental in their usage. We wouldn't view them as dative. To grace, for to grace you have been saved. That doesn't seem to make sense. And a dative, if this were dative, or for grace you have been saved, that doesn't seem to make sense either. Nor would the locative sense of in or on grace make sense here. The only thing that seems to make sense in Ephesians 2:8 is the instrumental case, and thus it's translated for by grace you have been saved. So whenever you see a use of instrumental case form in a sentence, you will translate it with or by. And now we come to the seventh case form, that of the accusative. And here you have for the singular tan naman or plural tous namus. And the accusative, as I've already mentioned, is going to be the case form for the object in a sentence, usually just direct object. And here I've translated it just law. You could translate it the law for the singular. And in the plural, actually, it should be translated laws for tous namus. It's a misprint there. But don't be surprised when you're doing your translation work that if the context seems to require omitting the definite article when you do your translation exercises, go ahead and just leave the article out. And that's why I didn't put it here in this case with the accusative. The accusative case is the case of limitation or extension. And most of the time, when you see a noun in the accusative case form, it's going to function as the direct object in the sentence. For instance, John 3:16, which you all know very well. For God so loved. Who does the acting? God does. He's the subject in the sentence. Ha theos. It's in the nominative case form, even though it's 4 words in before you encounter ha, or 5 if you encounter theos. And that's what I was saying before about how word order in Greek really doesn't matter now that you have the case system and you can identify what the subject of the sentence is based on the nominative case form of this noun for God, ha theos. But right after the nominative case form, the subject in the sentence, in the Greek, you see the object, ton kosmon. And so back to back, you can have subject followed by object. And the verb is before everything. Agapesin is the verb from agapao. This is a past tense form of the verb, which we'll get into in a future lesson as well. But what I want you to see here is ton kosmon. The word for world is kosmos. That would be its lexical form, its nominative case form. But here it's put in the accusative case form, which tells you that the recipient of the love of God is the world. It's the object receiving the action done by the subject, God. And again, just to review, the very last case form, the 8th case form, is what's called the vocative from vocalizing. And this is the case of address, as if we were speaking directly to the law and giving it an order or a command or something like that. For instance, here's a use of the vocative case of address in Mark 9, verse 17, where the word for teacher is used, didaskalos, but notice the ending is not omicron sigma, it's not didaskalos, teacher, it's didaskala. And the epsilon ending tells you that this is the vocative case form. In other words, somebody is speaking to Jesus and says, teacher, I brought you my son who was mute. So Jesus is being directly addressed here as teacher. That's the vocative case form. Here's another interesting case of the vocative case being used as the form of address. And this is the word for death, thanatos. But notice thanatos, the ending has changed in 1 Corinthians 15:55 to the epsilon ending, and it's used twice because death is being spoken to directly here. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? So hence the vocative case and case form. So those are the 8 different case uses and 5 different case forms for this lesson that you need to master again. Memorize the articles and the endings, and then know how they're used differently within a sentence. Now again, you should know these very well. And one thing you should note is that the case forms go from top to bottom. They decline or they fall in essence. And this is where we're going to get the word declensions from. Throughout this course, and anytime you read a Greek book on grammar or sometimes a commentary, you will hear the proper distinction between a noun and a verb, and these terms are attached to a noun or a verb Nouns technically are declined, where we speak of different declensions, and that comes from the Latin word casus, meaning a falling. And so just think of that paradigm that you just saw with the 8 different case forms for the different declensions, and you go from top to bottom. Think of it like a waterfall. The nouns are falling down or declining like a waterfall. And so when it comes to nouns, use the word declension. However, when it comes to verbs, these are different. They are put together in pieces more horizontally. For example, you see the word for luo there, and this is a past tense indicative form, elusa. And you'll notice there is the stem, lu. There is the past tense form for aorist, and that's the sigma. And then you have the alpha ending, but you also have the prefix epsilon. And so it's put together, or it's conjugated. And so whenever we speak of nouns, just think of declining or declensions, whereas verbs are conjugated, or the conjugation. Like, for instance, at the very beginning in your last lesson, you learned about the omega conjugation versus the me conjugation. So just, I want to be clear, there's 2 different technical terms, declension and conjugation, that you need to keep distinct. On this graphic, you see second declension noun forms. These are learned for Chapter 4 from your textbook. In Chapter 5, we'll get to first declension noun forms. And you might be saying, well, why are we learning second declension before first declension? That's a little confusing. Well, the only reason that we learn second declensions first is because they're easier. And there's only 2 of them, two sets of them, so to speak, for the masculine, feminine form, and then there's a separate form for the neuter. Whereas when you come to the first declension endings, there's 4 different sets of those. But all totaled for chapters 4 and 5 of your textbook, you're going to learn 6 different sets of case forms, singular and plural, for the first 2 declension sets. And so here you have the second declension forms, and you can see here that they tend to be mostly masculine and neuter words, but on rare occasions there can be a few feminine words as well that use second declension endings. Likewise, when we get to first declension types of noun endings, they're going to be mostly feminine in distinction to masculine for the second declension. So first declension is going to be mostly masculine, and then have a few, first declension is going to be mostly feminine, and then just have a few masculine nouns thrown in. Whereas second declension is mostly masculine with a few feminine nouns as well. And here are just a few rare feminine second declension words, such as the word for way or road, hadas. And you would think because of the Omicron sigma ending that it's going to be a masculine word, but it's not. It's actually feminine. And that's why it's preceded by he, the feminine article. And here again is the value of memorizing the proper article to go with the word or noun itself. The same is true with the word for desert below it, he erimas, and then the word for book below that, he biblos. Again, they all look like, based on their ending, that they're going to be masculine, but they're actually feminine. But they're second declension feminine words. So there's a few very rare feminine second declension nouns. Now we just looked at the second declension masculine and feminine forms, and here we have second declension neuter forms. And the only thing I want to point out here is just to show you that for the genitive, ablative, dative, locative, instrumental, it's going to be the same as what you just saw for the masculine, feminine second declension nouns. The only difference here is going to be in the spelling of the nominative case form and the accusative or vocative case forms. You'll see the article ta or ta instead of ha or hoi, for example, in the nominative case. Otherwise, they're exactly the same as the masculine forms for genitive through instrumental. So there's less memorization as long as you just spot some of the differences between the two sets. Before I introduce the first declension nouns, let me just summarize the distinction between second declension nouns and first declension nouns. Second declension nouns are going to be characterized by the omicron, whereas first declension nouns are going to be characterized by alpha or eta. Likewise, second declension nouns have two patterns. The masculine feminine forms are joined or similar, and then there's also going to be a separate neuter noun form, whereas there are four separate patterns in the first declension set of endings. And then again, for second declension nouns, it's mostly going to be masculine and neuter words, some very rare feminine words that have this, that fall into this category. Whereas when it comes to first declension nouns, they're mostly feminine words. At this point, you may be like most students, and you're feeling like this guy here in this slide. Having learned the 8-case system, your head is spinning, you're perhaps frustrated, and you're saying to yourself, yay, will I ever learn all this? And I just want to assure you, yes. In fact, there is one more case that I want to introduce to you that's not part of the 8. So that would be the 9th case, and that is the case of this guy right here in your slide. It's called the basket case. Maybe you feel like as a student, you're a basket case right now. But I want to encourage you and assure you that you will learn this. It's just a lot of memorization at this stage. But once you get this system memorized of these 8 cases and their endings and the 2 different sets of declensions, first declension, second declension, and the articles, and you get all this memorized for this lesson, you're going to see in future lessons again that everything else is built on this lesson for, again, pronouns and adjectives and other parts of speech, even participles later on. So this is the hard one. So just be patient, review as much as possible for this until you feel very comfortable that you've got this, all these endings and things memorized. So I just want to encourage you at this point before we go on. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, what's the point of all this? Let me just give you now some practical examples that will illustrate the wherefore of all this, or the why. So if I haven't lost you already, let's just go over a few examples now from the New Testament of why this case system is so important, and I'll show you some significant instances of this case system from verses in the New Testament. Here's an example from Galatians 5:16, speaking of the Christian life, and we have the word pneuma, which means spirit, and that's a third declension noun again that you're going to learn later. But for now, let's just look at this instance. It says, I say then, walk in the Spirit. And what case is this for pneuma? Well, you haven't learned third declension nouns yet, but the case system works the same for third declension nouns. So this would be either locative, instrumental. Which would it be? Would it be walk in the Spirit, as it's often translated? Well, it could be understood that way. If it's locative, we walk in the sphere of the Spirit rather than the sphere of the flesh per se. But I think a better translation would be instrumental. And knowing that dative, locative, and instrumental are all spelled exactly the same in Greek, you would be justified in translating it this way. I say then, walk by means of, or by the Spirit, instead of in the Spirit. Because again, it's showing the means by which we live the Christian life is not our own strength or power, but it's the power of the Spirit of God who indwells us. And so you could translate this legitimately, walk by or by means of the Spirit. Here's a similar example as it pertains to the Holy Spirit in our Christian life from Ephesians 5:18. And don't be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation or a wasted life, but be filled with the Spirit. And here you have the preposition en, which you'll learn later means in or on or sometimes by. But in this case, again, we have the word pneuma, and again, it's in the dative locative instrumental form. And so you've got to figure out, well, which of the three senses makes best sense in this sentence. It could be to or for in the dative sense. It could be in or on in the locative sense, or it could be with or by in the instrumental sense. And here I think it's clearly instrumental. And so we have the same word in case as the previous example from Galatians 5:16, but now with the preposition in, could be translated in or by. And so it could be either locative or it could be instrumental. I tend to think it's more instrumental again. Be filled by the Spirit. It could be understood that way, or with the Holy Spirit. Here's another debated example from Galatians 2, verse 16, where it is translated, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. And it goes on. Some older translations have, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, implying that it could be Christ's faith that justifies us, or hence his faithfulness that justifies us. That's how it's understood by some. However, I do think it's properly translated by the New King James Version here. And you see there's a preposition, again, which you haven't learned yet, dia, and then pisteos is the word for faith, and then Iesu Christou is Jesus Christ again, here in the genitive case form for Jesus Christ. But the word for faith there is in a particular case form where it could be understood as by the faith of Jesus Christ or faith in Jesus Christ. And I tend to think it's locative rather than instrumental, by Jesus Christ's faith. And this is the difference between the subjective genitive use or the objective genitive use. If Jesus Christ is the subject doing the believing, if it's his faith, then it would be a subjective genitive. But in this case, it's faith in the object of Jesus Christ. He's the object of our faith. So it's objective genitive, I think, is the correct understanding of this debated verse. One of the values of learning Greek is that you come to understand what some of the interpretative parameters are, so to speak. You know, well, it could mean this and it could mean that. You know at least what your options are. And so it can help you from being overly dogmatic, or at least knowing that it has to be one of these two options. And so it's helpful in that regard. Now here's another example of this difference between the subjective and objective genitives. It's 2 Corinthians 5:14 that speaks of the love of Christ compels us. Well, is it our love for Christ, or is it Christ's love for us? Well, if it's Christ's love for us, the love which belongs to Christ, if that's the sense, then this would be the subjective genitive. It's the subject's love. In this case, Christ does the loving. Whereas, if it's the latter case, our love for Christ, then it would be translated for the love for Christ compels us. In other words, our love for Christ compels us, which frankly I don't find a very compelling interpretation or translation, since his love for us is far greater than our love for him. So I think it's definitely a subjective genitive sense here in 2 Corinthians 5:14. But again, it's genitive case form if you were to look it up in Greek, and you would see that you have a couple of these interpretative options. They're both genitive case form It's genitive case form in 2 Corinthians 5:14. You just have to determine which you think it might be, subjective or objective. And here's another significant interpretative example of the importance of the genitive. In Romans 1, verse 5, we have the genitive case form used, but it could be understood in a couple of different ways, and they're pretty significant differences. In the New King James Version, it says, for the obedience to the faith, whereas the New American Standard Bible says, for the obedience of faith. If it's the latter, the obedience of faith, then this would be understood as the obedience which is faith. In other words, there's one command that God is giving the lost to fulfill for their eternal salvation, and that is simply to believe the gospel. And when you believe the gospel, you have obeyed the gospel. And so I think this latter sense of the New American Standard Bible, for the obedience of faith, or which is faith, that's actually more accurate. And it fits with what Paul says later in Romans 10, verses 16 and 17, about here, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. And who has obeyed the gospel? Those who believe it. The same is true in 2 Thessalonians 1, verses 8 through 10, where it speaks of obeying the gospel by believing it. And so God has one command for the lost world, Acts 16:31, to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. This is what's called the genitive of apposition. And here's a significant example of the genitive case form again, where I think it's being used as a genitive of apposition, further modifying or qualifying the noun that precedes. And so in Titus 3:5, it says, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy. By the washing, he saved us, it should say, by the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Spirit. And here the phrase, the washing of regeneration, is a genitive case. And I think it's saying the washing which is regeneration. And so of regeneration simply further modifies the washing. It's not the washing of baptism, but it's the washing which is the Holy Spirit's work of regeneration. So this is what would be called the genitive case form is in this instance, but being used as a genitive of apposition. So these are just some like second-year Greek concepts that I'm just introducing to you here to show you the significance of learning these case forms and why they're relevant for Bible interpretation and exegesis, which you'll build on in future courses. So that concludes Lesson 3. Again, let me encourage you just to take your time, learn this content very well, be patient with it, and go over it, review, and repetitiously write out these various forms until you know them very well. It will serve you well going forward in future lessons to really get this material down well in your understanding and in your memory. And trust the Lord as you do, and the Lord will give you all that you stand in need of. And that concludes Lesson 3.